So, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Welcome to the United States Institute of Peace. My name is Bill Taylor. I'm one of the vice presidents here at the Institute, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to welcome friends and maybe a student or two. I'll get to that in a minute, and others that are here to help welcome and give greetings to a new book that Nick Kralev and his team have put together. You're in the right place. Just to be sure you're in the right place, here we are with this book launch. This is, I mentioned the students. I was thinking about, actually I was asked to teach a class this summer semester, on how embassies work around the world. And I had not done this before, and someone had taught the class before, and they were using a book, which I'm sure is fine, just to be clear. I'm sure it's fine. However, it wasn't exactly what we needed. And right at that time, this is about like 3 months ago, this showed up in the mail. And it's brilliant. It is just what we need. It is readable, it is interesting, it is dynamic, it's got great stories in it. It's a text. Let's be clear. It's a text. It even has kind of exercises at the end of each chapter, which is useful for me as a first-time professor, teacher. And it is a very readable book, focused, as you can tell, on diplomatic tradecraft. The editor, Nick, put together a great team. He wrote some of the chapters, which he'll talk to you about, but he also pulled together some people who are in this room. Several of the other authors are in this room here today. So I'm very pleased to be able to host this. I'm looking forward to this conversation. So I've kind of introduced Nick Kralev, the co-author and editor. He's also written a book called America's Other Army, Diplomats in the Trenches, which I've not read, I confess, but I will, Nick. And he wants to say a word or two just at the beginning before we get started to thank some of the authors, some of the contributors too. So Nick, why don't you come do that?
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador Taylor, and I'm delighted to be back at USIP and grateful to you and the Institute for hosting the launch of Diplomatic Tradecraft. Well, it's a time of heightened conflict, acrimony, and discord around the world, so I think we all can use better diplomacy skills. And I'm thrilled that we can let you know today that there is finally a book that teaches just those skills. Now, I expect, and at least I hope, that governments around the world will be using this book to train their diplomats, and universities will lean on it to instruct, to impart some practical skills for their students, in addition to the instruction in theory that they already provide. But I also think that the general public can benefit from many of the skills and competencies this book offers. I conceived it about 4 years ago, and the main reason was that we at the Washington International Diplomatic Academy, which I founded 7 years ago, needed a textbook, and there wasn't one. So I thought, why not adapt some of the material that we've been teaching? And so I asked some of our instructors and a few other current and former Foreign Service officers to contribute to the various chapters, and so they did. We have several of them here today, in addition to Ambassador Tom Pickering, whom Ambassador Taylor will introduce in a minute. We have several of them. They're all ambassadors, so forgive me if I don't say ambassador every time. But I do want to publicly thank them for their insights and their contribution. And so from left to right, we have Ambassador Jean Abercrombie Winstanley, Doug Silliman, Eunice Reddick, Lisa Kubisky, Charles Ray, John Teft, and James Zumwalt. So thank you again for helping me make this book possible. And thank you all for coming. I see that we have members of the current and former Foreign Diplomatic Corps in Washington, with the former ambassador of Bulgaria sitting right here. And thanks to my parents for coming all the way from Bulgaria for this. And from... It wasn't just this. Yesterday was, well, I had a very round birthday. So there were 2 reasons to come from Bulgaria. Anyway, thanks to you all for coming, and I look forward to our discussion. Thanks.
So Nick, when you get to the age that Ambassador Pickering and I are, we don't talk about birthdays anymore. We're all done with those. So we are very pleased to have as the moderator for this conversation Indira Lakshmanan. Indira is the Ideas and Opinions Editor of U.S. News and War Report. So this is what she does. She does ideas, and this is a great idea. She's gone to more than 80 countries, probably all the countries represented on this front row here. And she's reported on human rights and pivotal world events. Indira, we're so glad to have you here. And icon of the diplomatic corps over the past number of years, Ambassador Tom Pickering. We are so pleased to have Tom back in this building. He's been here several times. He helps us out on a lot of things. He's got several projects going. He's got a lot of projects going, which I won't even go into. However, what brings him here, in addition to having co-authored some of the chapters in Nick's book, Tom, as we know, has been the ambassador in Russia, India, Israel, Jordan, Nigeria, El Salvador, and the United Nations. Not to mention being number 3 in the State Department as P, as we call it, the Undersecretary for Political Affairs. So a great panel. Tom, welcome again. Nick, congratulations. And Indira, over to you.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, and I want to thank everyone for coming. This is an incredibly important book. In Washington, we have books that are exciting and books that are worthy, and this book is both. So I'm thrilled that you would all come today, and thank you to the ambassadors who contributed and helped to make this book possible. So I am just thrilled to be here. Both Ambassador Taylor and Ambassador Pickering have been quoted in countless articles I've written about diplomacy for Bloomberg and the Boston Globe and other places. And Nicholas, I'm honored to have worked with as a fellow member of the Diplomatic Press Corps. We traveled all around the world on Hillary Clinton's plane for many years together. So when Nick asked me to do this, I was thrilled. And immediately the first question that came to mind was, how do you, as a former journalist, end up being the person who's writing a textbook on diplomacy? And how is it possible that there wasn't another textbook on diplomacy before? So let me start there, Nicholas.
Well, thank you. And I'm, yes, very honored to be sitting next to Ambassador Pickering, who was very helpful, particularly on in the chapter on negotiation in the book, because his experience is unmatched. But to answer your question, I have to tell a story, which is what I used to do for a living, right? And the story begins sort of 20 years ago, but really much earlier. And so I'll go back to the fall of the Berlin Wall, when I was 15. I knew nothing about diplomacy. But it turns out that what diplomats do actually affects people's lives. Who knew? Right, who knew? So had it not been for the role of diplomacy in both ending the Cold War and transitioning from a very different political and economic systems in Central and Eastern Europe to what we have there now, I would not be here. I would not have come to the United States. I would have not gone to Harvard and done all the other things that I've done. So in other words, my life would have been completely different had it not been for the products of American and Western diplomacy, both before and after the end of the Cold War. So I always wanted to be a journalist because there were so many interesting stories to tell in that part of the world at the time. But then when I came here, I wanted to focus entirely on covering foreign policy and diplomacy. And so that's what I did for more than a decade. And about 20 years ago, I became very interested in the Foreign Service, in the US Foreign Service. I began traveling with the Secretary of State, who was Madeleine Albright at the time, in 2000. And I did it until Secretary Clinton, as Indira mentioned. Now, there are many journalists traveling with the Secretary of State, but nobody else wanted to write a book about the Foreign Service. And so I asked Colin Powell, who was Secretary of State at the time I began my research, to give me access to about 60 to 80 embassies around the world. And so I could go in and spend a few days in each of them and interview Foreign Service members, not just officers, but all kinds of Foreign Service members. And so I'd started doing this in 2003 and 2004, wrote a series in the Washington Times on the Foreign Service. When I first began traveling with the Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, I was doing that for the Financial Times, and then I'd moved to the Washington Times. And then, after I decided to leave journalism in 2010, I finally had time to write a book about the Foreign Service. So the book that I always wanted to write, and I had no time, I actually wrote it in 2012. That's the book America's Other Army, which Ambassador Taylor just mentioned. And while promoting the book and speaking at events like this, or even ministries of foreign affairs in different countries, I was shocked to find out how neglected diplomacy is everywhere, particularly in training. So the system that I thought existed, I mean, I think I'm right, but the system I saw did not make sense to me. And here's what the system is. Most governments take in people into their foreign service who either have a master's degree in international relations in some countries. In our case, we have exams to join the foreign service. But these exams are not the general knowledge exams. Yeah, I know that the oral exam has a couple of exercises, but I don't think the system is designed to select the best or the most promising people to succeed as career diplomats. And then we bring them in and we give them 5 or 6 weeks of orientation, but we don't really give them proper training in what I call tradecraft. And then we throw them into the deep end to sink or swim. And it takes them years to learn how to do their job well. So that's what doesn't make sense to me. We aren't requiring anything to join the foreign service, right? We want a diverse foreign service, which is a very valid point, which means that there are people who are former journalists and businessmen and lawyers and art gallery directors and parole officers in penitentiaries in different parts of the country. And we say, well, that's okay. We want people with a variety of skills, which is, again, a very, very good point and needed. But we're not giving them solid training, a foundation on which to hone in their skills and become better. Yes.
Well, let me follow up on that, because Ambassador Pickering, we're so lucky and grateful to have you here. I don't think there's probably anybody who's had as many positions, anybody currently who has had as many ambassadorships as you have, and all the way up to the number 3 in the State Department. So let me ask you, because you did a lot of learning on the job in so many positions, and the sort of mantra of the Foreign Service and government in general has been, there's no real training for it. Sure, you can go to Georgetown, you can study diplomacy, but in fact, you really need to learn on the job. So tell me about that. Do you agree with that mantra that, diplomacy can't be taught in the classroom, and that in fact, you have to be fired by the real world experiences?
Let me begin, Indira, by telling you a brief story. My mother frequently asked what I was doing in the Foreign Service, and when I reeled off where I was, she said, "That sounds wonderful, but why can't you keep a job?"
That I'm Dutch.
My experience has been that about 15 years ago, 3 or 4 Foreign Service retirees sat down at a Washington club and said, there needs to be more opportunity for formal education and training for people working in diplomacy. Foreign service officers were very much on our mind, but we also thought of civil servants. We thought of people from the Defense Department, so engaged people from agriculture and commerce, people from the intelligence community, and so on. And we did a number of studies. And one of them was, is the NSC really working effectively, and how to prepare for that? We brought together administrative assistants from senior congressional figures, senators and congressmen, with a group of similarly experienced foreign service officers for a series of seminars. And that got pandemicized, but we're starting it again. And we took a look at the fact that the military exploited effectively the concept of war games. And so we converted it to peace games. We worked with a very good private firm supporting the University of Maryland in gaming, and came up, and we've now had 6 or 8 sessions. And this building has become the new host and central operator for us of the Peace Games activity in concert with us. And we're looking finally at putting it on the budget payroll of the Congress, if I could put it that way, on a permanent basis, rather than seeking to raise money from well-intentioned people all across the United States, which we have done. We've raised, I think, close to $2 million for that particular capacity alone. So there's much going on. And it points up several lessons that you iterated. One, that formal training and education in diplomacy is not sufficient at present circumstances for carrying it forward. That a lot of us have learned through what we call on-the-job training. I had the particular good fortune of requiring a carpool in order to stay alive to go to work and still have a wife. And I carpooled with a very senior officer who later offered me several jobs to work for him. I then carpooled with Joseph Nye, a name that will be familiar to you from the Kennedy School at Harvard. And this was an exhilarating learning experience, because I had 45 minutes morning and 45 minutes in the evening, barring tornadoes and snowstorms, which extended the time, to go through a kind of Q&A examination of what it was that we were each doing and how and in what way it affected each of us and what lessons we had learned. And that was in itself quite useful. I would not say that we should abandon on-the-job learning, but I think we should expand it and push it. And finally, we have done a very good job in the U.S. Foreign Service in language training. And it is a key subject, and I'll talk more about it later if people want to. But it is, in my view, a fundamental tool, not just for understanding what other people are thinking and doing, but for creating a relationship. And that's very significant, and there were times when it particularly helped me in my foreign service period that made a real difference in how and in what way I could perform effectively to support the U.S. government interests and its relationships with governments and diplomats around the world where I was working.
Can I follow up on that? Yes, please.
I completely agree with everything Ambassador Pickering said. No one is saying that on-the-job training should be abolished or minimized or diminished. Absolutely not. Here's really the heart of the matter, in the way I think of it, which is essentially the topic of this discussion. There has been what's called military doctrine for over 100 years. It's an essential part of any national security strategy. There has never been a diplomatic equivalent to that, which means that in statecraft, you over-focus on force. And if you look at the last 20 years, I mean more, but at least the last 20 years, you will see, particularly in US foreign policy, the over-reliance on force, right? Well, I think diplomacy should be the first resort. So why has there not been diplomatic doctrine? Well, that's essentially a body of interrelated operational concepts, right? How to practice a certain profession. And I've thought a long time about this, because after all, diplomacy is viewed as a structured profession. Well, if it's viewed as a profession to begin with, but that's another topic. And people think of the protocol and all that, so they have rules. Well, unfortunately, when it comes to professionalism and tradecraft, there are no set standards, like there would be in military tradecraft or military doctrine. What I mean by this is, and I'll give you a very specific example. When I started my research 20 years ago, I was in an African country at the US Embassy, and the chargé d'affaires at the time introduced me to the chief of the political economic section. And he told me that she was one of the best he knew in the Foreign Service. 2 weeks later, I was in China, talking to the DCM, the Deputy Chief of Mission there. And he knew the person who was supposed to be one of the best. He said, oh, she actually is one of the worst I've ever seen, right? So how can the same officer be viewed as one of the best and one of the worst at the same time? Who decides these things? What are the criteria? What are the standards? What is the baseline? There isn't one, right? Well, how are we supposed to take diplomacy seriously as a profession then? Right? So that's why I now say that diplomacy to me is an underdeveloped profession. In fact, I think that many people don't view it as a real profession. That's why we have all these political appointees in the system, right? A third of ambassadors. How can no other country in the world has a third of its ambassadors to be political appointees? I have nothing against having political appointees in the system because, let's face it, career people are bureaucrats, right? They need infusion of new blood and new ideas from time to time. But to have a third of ambassadors, 99% of whom have no qualifications to practice diplomacy, I think is absurd. But then, if you look at our entry-level officers, they're not that much more qualified to practice diplomacy either. Until 5, 6 years, perhaps, on average, into their career. And so what I'm saying is, if rather than spend the money to move them around the world twice by their year 5, at which point they get tenured, some of them don't, a few don't, and they have to go out to leave. But to me, it will be a much better expenditure of money rather than have this tenure system for the first 5 years and move people, because they're still doing regular jobs. They're not in apprenticeships or traineeships. No, they're doing regular jobs, and sometimes managing budgets of millions of dollars and managing people, by the way, right? Most of whom are much older than they are, but that's another story. And so why not have a system where we spend a year training them, really training them, and not in theories or history, training them in tradecraft, right, and then send them out, right? That's, now I know that this probably seems utopian at this point because the system is what it is, and one needs to move mountains to change what happens in government. But it seems to me it'll be much more efficient, and at the end of the day, it'll be in the US interest to have entry-level officers who go out and they know the basics at least, right, the fundamentals, and build on them. But on-the-job training is indispensable. Diplomacy is indeed the kind of profession that I'm in the middle on this, right? Some people say, well, you cannot teach it in the classroom. And then other people may say, well, a degree in international relations will make you prepared. No. International relations is an academic discipline. Diplomatic practice is something quite different. That's why a former parole officer who worked on Staten Island, whom I met, by the way, during my research, can be in the Foreign Service and be effective without a degree in international relations, right? Anyway, at the FBI, the CIA, they all have boot camps, right? You go in, you pass exams, you go into the academy, you train for a certain number of months, whatever it is, then you have more exams, right? So not everybody who enters training comes out and then into the workforce. In our case, everybody who passes the entrance process comes in, right? And so, in my mind, why not have something like a diplomatic boot camp? That what is 6 months or a year, it doesn't really, I'll take either. But at least we will know during that training, which focuses on tradecraft, who could be a good diplomat and who cannot. So we don't have a situation, right, where one officer is perceived as both the best and the worst by people in the Foreign Service.
Well, some of that obviously has to do
Yeah,
with personality, but
That's
yes.
redolent with the opportunity to comment.
Yes.
Let me try to narrow it down. I agree with the fundamental proposition that more engagement and training is important and valuable. I also agree that there is no standard text, but there are a lot of ideas that you've captured in the book that are helpful in pushing things ahead. The ability to listen, the ability to write, the ability
Empathize.
to understand how to report, the ability to conduct personal relationships on the basis that you are building a permanent set of areas of mutual respect, even with people who may fundamentally differ, because your job obviously is first to understand how they think and why, and secondly, to be creative in working out the way fundamentally to deal successfully with them and their problems. And that's a big people relationship opportunity. I was one of a very few Foreign Service officers, for reasons that are understandable but not necessarily wise, taking up our time and going through. And my initial assignment was in the State Department and not overseas. And I enormously benefited from the idea that I was in the middle of where the decision-making took place and where the policy debates were more fundamental and where people brought the grouping of ideas, thoughts, influences, and backdrops to how and what way to make this work, including clearly the influence of the domestic political sphere on how to bring this about. And that was absolutely invaluable. Now, I have complained to people who have been horrified that all Foreign Service officers, in order to make up a problem in the pyramid that makes up the Foreign Service, do their first tour in consular work. And consular work has a certain advantage in practicing a foreign language if your consular work is in a foreign language. And consular work has a certain taxing of judgment. It is also a basis for looking at whether you can do effectively this kind of work for a governmental entity. And that goes into the reports people write on you, which determines whether you're going to get promoted, if so, how fast, and for what reasons. So it is not entirely absent. But there is a huge amount of material you do not get perhaps until your third, fourth, or fifth year in your first tour in the State Department. Now, tours are also put in place by how many people we have to go where and how much we need. And this is a difficult kind of square to make into the circle, so to speak, to make all of that work. But that can be very, very useful in moving things ahead. Finally, doctrine. We are, and I've looked at this for 40-some years, quite poor at strategizing. We do very little of fundamentally describing the objective we seek. We do less well at prioritizing, particularly across the globe, not just within regional areas. We are heavily a regionally based foreign policy machine, but we are now introducing a huge amount of what I would call fundamentally functional issues. Issues defined by science, issues defined by ecology, issues defined by financial analysis that all have to figure into what are the right foreign policy decision makings. Much of that you can get in the classroom, and much of that is determined. The lack of useful strategy and good strategy, in my view, is a critical factor in how we work. I have never been in a major meeting on foreign policy at the White House or in the State Department where the first question always asked is, what's our objective? It always comes as an afterthought down the road. A really interesting comment, but some that I think is not so strange. So there's much reform and a great deal of repair to be done. The Foreign Service grouping of personnel, the Foreign Service officers, and their institution and their union has over the years stimulated much of this rethinking about how and in what way we conduct foreign policy, and how and in what way we train, and how and in what way we evolve doctrine, strategy, and other questions. But there are many, many issues. Poor strategic analysis and thinking, and a serious problem of how we link budgetary availabilities with policy actions. And those are just a few. We do very little after-action reporting. And we depend on the people who formulate at the top level policy-making decisions to correct their own errors. And to some extent, that's not easy. Foreign Service officers step up to that, many with enthusiasm, and many are willing to say, these things have changed, we were not right in the first place, we need to change here, and they track what they're doing, but it does require something of a commitment and a knowledge base that can bring people to say, in effect, I was not entirely right in my earlier recommendations, here's how we fix it.
You know, I'm struck by what Ambassador Pickering said earlier about wanting to institutionalize and send the bill to Congress for, you know, a practical teaching approach, which I think is a fantastic idea. And Nicholas, we know that to get Congress to approve the money, to appropriate the money for things like this is not easy. As it is, there are constantly wanting to cut, there are forces in Congress who constantly want to cut funding to the United Nations, funding to diplomacy at the same time that they're willing to increase funding to military spending. I always thought it was fascinating when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State and Bob Gates was Secretary of Defense, the way they had a sort of like 1-2 act where they would talk together, where he would say, you know, actually, I'd like you to give more money to my colleague over here at the Secretary of State. She actually needs the money and she can be preventive so that then I don't have to spend the money in a war. It was a really nice thing that they had going, and I think it was actually quite effective at the time in persuading members of Congress that there should be more money given to prevention and diplomacy. I think that some of that has fallen off now, and I think that we again see, because of political reasons, a lot of factors in Congress where you don't see as much attention to diplomacy, much more attention on military. So tell me, what is there, how do you see it as a way to almost like project, and this connects to your experience as a journalist, project to the American public why diplomacy is so important? And could that in turn put pressure on our elected officials, put pressure on all forms of government to invest more in diplomacy? You know, and I think of it in a popular culture way, the huge success of that television show, The Diplomat, or the television show, Madam Secretary. People loved those shows, although many diplomats said, okay, not very accurate, but still fun to watch. How do you make diplomacy so attractive and important and real to people's lives such that, you know, the powers that be who control the purse strings see why it's important to invest in diplomacy?
Well, thanks. So let me pick up on Congress and funding for training in particular, because they've actually done more than most people think. As I mentioned before, Colin Powell started a drive to improve training, and the Foreign Service Institute today is a much better institution than it was when Powell was Secretary of State. I just want to put that on the record. I also want to acknowledge that there are many, many fantastic Foreign Service officers. Some of them are here in the room today. What I said about entry level is not meant to denigrate any of the skills and the mastery of many of our Foreign Service officers. The problem was that they got to that level, Ambassador Pickering, Ambassador Bill Burns, who is currently at the CIA, the ambassadors here, right? It wasn't the system that produced them. It was their own, whatever they had, acumen, DNA, whatever, and then perhaps luck, being in the right place at the right time, but it wasn't something that was built into the system that produced the fabulous diplomats they became, right? Because we all know that when there are good ones, there are also bad ones. So Congress. Congress in the last several years has actually funded training at the Foreign Service Institute. But I was just talking to a current ambassador, US ambassador, serving, who they were all here last week for their Chief of Mission Conference. And what came up was that the money that Congress has given the State Department for FSI in particular and for training has been spent mainly on adding new courses to their catalog on all kinds of subjects. And it's not clear that all of those subjects are really needed for more than a handful of people, right? My impression of FSI, and I was lucky enough to be given access to what at the time was called A100, which is the initial orientation course that every new Foreign Service officer goes through, when I was writing my book, America's Other Army. And it's been, of course, 12 years, so things have changed somewhat. But fundamentally, I still believe that FSI focuses more on bureaucratics than on tradecraft. And if you look at, I'll just give you one example. Let's say you just came into the Foreign Service, you decided to choose the political or economic career tracks. You go through your 6 weeks of orientation, because that A100 is now called Foreign Service Orientation, and it's about 6 weeks. They don't even pretend to call it training, they call it orientation to the State Department and the system and the bureaucracy. So let's say that you are going to do, Ambassador Pickering talked about consular work, right? Every Foreign Service officer has to do consular work at the beginning of their career. But not all of them do it on their first tour, because it can be done on the second tour. So let's say you are going to be an officer in the political section at the embassy anywhere. So after the 6 weeks, if you need to learn a foreign language, so if you're going to a country whose language you don't speak, then they will give you fantastic training, as Ambassador Pickering mentioned, in that language. That is, the FSI is the best in language training. But then, the actual tradecraft, what are you going to do in that political section in whatever country you're going to, right? Nobody, unless you've worked at an embassy, you don't know what actually happens in an embassy behind the scenes, right? What does an officer in the political section do every day, right? What skills do they need? How do they do it, right? How do they learn to do it? Right now is by osmosis. You just observe and shadow more senior officers, right? So this course that you take at FSI, it's a 3-week course. It's for political and economic officers combined. So in 3 weeks, how do you teach tradecraft, both economic and political? I'm sorry. So that's why I'm saying that the focus on the bureaucratics of it rather than the tradecraft of it. And just to end my long answer to your question about the public, right? So I was very flattered a few months ago when the creator and executive producer of The Diplomat sent me an email to tell me that she and her team read my previous book, America's Other Army, at the beginning of the process of writing the pilot script. Now, then I wondered, if you read it, why did you write such an outlandish plot for the pilot? Because there is no way that a career Foreign Service officer gets London, to be under 2 ambassadors in London, right? That they get confirmed almost overnight. Right? That just, and I appreciate anything in pop culture. So this is actually the key word, pop culture. I think the answer to a question is that the best shortcut to the outcome that you implied in your question is pop culture. There is no question. Because no matter how many events like this we do, and how many stories are written in the media, it's pop culture. If you look at other professions that are revered, or at least understood, or at least in which there is interest in the public, where does it come from? It's movies and TV shows.
Right.
That's it. And of course, it's better to have shows like The Diplomat and Madam Secretary than not to have them. Absolutely. But I wish that someone at some point, maybe it'll be me, who knows, but that would write a show, a pilot for a script, whatever, that is much more realistic, right? And I know that you have to fictionalize and you have to make it appealing to a general audience, and that's fine. But I don't know why you need to put in things that will just never happen, right? Just as a plot twist. I think what I'm saying is, a foreign service career is fascinating enough as it is, right? To invent things that just will never happen. That's my answer.
Yeah, maybe I can just make a comment, Nick. It appears that you're tilting in the direction that all diplomats should be uniformly the same. They should operate as automatons and not as individual thinkers. That their role in creating personal relationships is produced out of set-piece scripts that they can apply almost as if they pushed a button somewhere embedded in their arm that started that process going and made it all work. When in effect, it is very much of a human endeavor. It requires a full appreciation of all of the human differences and frailties. It is creative in many ways because it is built on the notion that personal relationships and personal contexts and personal interaction is maybe the essence of what makes a good diplomat, and that the knowledge base on which you do that is something that you can get through academia, and you can perhaps get good advice on things that work and things that don't work. But there is not, in my view, a universal theory that applies to all diplomacy, and that it must be culturally very sensitive to where you're working. And in many places, what's humorous to you is not to your friends and colleagues of the other nationality. And figuring it out, I always found that the hardest things to understand in a foreign language are poetry and jokes.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, let me just respond, because it's actually that is not the what I was saying. I'm absolutely not saying that all diplomats should be the same. I agree with everything you said now and before, which is to say that what I'm getting as when you teach skills, right? You're not teaching people to read from the same script or from the same talking points, right? I'm talking about things like empathy, for example, right? So I think the best diplomacy is done through practicing empathy for the views of others, right? I think the basis of diplomacy is empathy for the views of others, not agreeing with them. It is understanding them, right? How are you going to influence someone else?
It is friendly honesty.
Right, exactly, right? So I'm not talking about teaching someone how to respond in a certain situation, right? I'm just talking about giving them the practice through exercises and case studies, right, through which they can learn to develop their own skill rather than forcing them to adopt the skill of another officer, right? That's what I'm suggesting. And I absolutely agree that personal relationships are the bread and butter of diplomacy, whether it's bilateral and multilateral. At the end of the day, you represent your country and you defend and promote its interests, right? And so in a way you do have the same script because you are advocating for the same policies. How you do it is different in every country. That's right. But I still think that there is a way to learn the foundation of a skill like this before you get sent out overseas. And now it's your job to then adapt what you were taught based on the history of the country, the language of the country, the mentality of the people, right? The personal connections you will establish, or the connections that the embassy has already established before you even showed up, right? And to process all this and come up with the best way, right, to use the foundation that you were given in the FSI classroom or wherever it might have been, right, and adapt it. So that's why I'd rather have practical exercises and other forms of training based on real life case studies Because Ambassador Pickering said something very, very important at the beginning, which was follow through. Lessons learned. Right, the military is fantastic at lessons learned. And the State Department has been trying, I must say. When Bill Burns was Deputy Secretary, he made a push for it. And they're trying. There is even an office at FSI that is now supposed to look at the lessons learned. But I don't think, I agree with Ambassador Pickering, it's not nearly enough.
When we created the policy planning staff in an interesting way, and a good bit of what it should be doing is absorbing lessons learned and being a team B, that they do not have what I would call emotional attachment to a brilliant policy idea, which now needs change.
Ambassador Pickering, earlier on, you really laid out for us some of the skills that you think are most important for effective diplomats. Now, of course, the personalities, the number of people who are in the Foreign Service, that represents the number of different personalities and ways that those skills will be carried out. Is there some kind of rule of thumb you can give us in your many, many years and working with both older diplomats who you referred to, who were some of your mentors, and younger ones who you yourself mentored? What are some of the characteristics that have made for the most effective diplomats who you have worked with, either in our own Foreign Service or in other nations' foreign services?
I think the ability to develop a long-term relationship with the key interlocutor. And I had the privilege of having as my counterpart that I met with most frequently in Israel, the Prime Minister. And I met frequently with the King of Jordan. And it was in that set of relationships which put the U.S. in a position where, in effect, I had access to the top decision maker and could deal with their concerns and with how and in what way I conveyed our concerns. And you get very quickly in the view of, from what I know about the people I've been dealing with, what will they think of this particular idea or this particular proposal? And it will help you shape the presentation of that idea on the basis of your past history of discussion. First, you have to get the past history. So first is obviously respect and dignity, and understanding, and the ability to question in a way that is amicable to the other person because they know you're seriously interested. And secondly, that you can cover ground that you know Washington is interested in because you're also working 100% of the day for Washington. And you have to, in your reporting, go back to them and say, I followed up with the following kinds of questions, or I didn't follow up with the following kinds of questions because this person has already told me X, Y, and Z, that either make that unnecessary or I've got the answer, I don't need it, on the basis of what he said about the attitude and so forth going down the road. I also think that you have to be able to shape the hard question in a very friendly way. And you can do that through the personal relationship. I'm going to ask you a tough question, and I understand that this is the kind of question that's sensitive. And I'm not putting you on the spot, and you can decide to tell me or not to tell me whatever you want. But it is significant and important for our mutual relationship that we have some understanding of your thinking. Or ask a question in the form of, please give me your advice, you know, about this particular question. Where do you think it will go? Or what should we be doing or thinking about? They're more interested, obviously, in influencing you, and that's the device you can get them to be a bit more under your influence as you move ahead. So there are things that come out of personal relationships. My father was a salesman, and he taught me a lot about how and in what way a respectful approach and an interesting and interested approach made a real difference with a customer with whom he was working than the idea that it was confrontational, or that bluster would solve the problem, or that appeals to ideas and thoughts that the other side of the table considered to be intrusive or maybe even insulting could be avoided by workarounds about saying that I have people in Washington now asking me these sorts of questions. They're uncomfortable, but give me your advice. What do you think, kind of thing. And people are, in many ways, happy to be asked for their advice as opposed to be put in the dock with a lawyer-like inquisition in terms of what you're dealing. I think finally listening is I mentioned this earlier, listening is a very important and interesting aspect of what you do. And listening can be the fountainhead for questioning down the road. But you listen for several reasons. It's sometimes very hard to adjust yourself to precisely what people are telling you, particularly in a foreign language. But you want to do that. You want to understand what it is they're saying. Then, secondly, at the next level down in the layer cake, you want to understand what you think they mean. Because sometimes what they say doesn't convey entirely what they mean. And the third layer in depth is, as I listen, can I develop some kind of analysis of what they might settle for? Can I begin to winnow that out of the process? And those are things that are interesting. I also think that you want to be careful, particularly with a very senior foreign official, to give them the view that your part of the conversation is as much absorbing as it is disseminating. And that's quite significant too. And I think that's all very, very helpful. I had opportunities with some senior officials where they would invite me to come by their home in the evening to talk over a drink about what's going on and where things are and how and in what way the U.S. is looking at what they're doing. And that was very valuable. I had the opportunity in Israel to be the ambassador to a government that was formed of a national unity coalition. And it included Labor on the left, and it included Likud on the extreme right. And for the first year and a half of a 3-year term, Labor was in charge, and I dealt with Prime Minister Peres. But then Shamir, the Likud leader, was the foreign minister. And I didn't want to ignore him. I wanted to develop a relationship with him. And when I went to see him, of course, he insisted on conducting the conversation through interpreters, Hebrew and English. And I knew that he did not have a lot of English. But after my second meeting with him, a friend told me he spoke very, very good French. And I said, well, how is that? He was arrested by the British, sent to Ethiopia after they captured him from the Italians, escaped from the camp, and went to French Somaliland, now Djibouti. And he asked for asylum. And the French said, yes, but you've got to learn French. And he did. And so I went to him and I said to him in French, we both understand and speak French. Could we start having a series of luncheons? You'll be my guest. And we'll go to hotels which are all kosher. And just the two of us. And it worked. And I developed a relationship. The real interesting problem is when he became prime minister, I walked into his office with a couple of his guys who didn't speak French, and I spoke to him in French, and he said, no, 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 I've studied English, we're going to do it in English. And he was a very, very determined man. And so we shifted right away to English.
That's a great story, and it reminds me two sort of takeaways from that. One is, of course, that the skills you're discussing that are so key for a successful diplomat are important for all of us who are not in diplomacy. I listen to that and I think, I could use that as a manager.
That's
I could, like it's important for every professional. Exactly. Well, in every relationship. And the other thing I'm thinking of is the famous saying, of course, that the art of diplomacy is telling someone how to go to hell and have them look forward to the trip.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Now they'll show you the way.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes, yeah. Well, yeah, this is so great. So I wanted to add a couple of things on your question in particular about skills. We have a whole chapter in the book outlining the core skills. There are others, but of course, you can't put everything, and as Ambassador Pickering pointed out, it's not always the same, right? You need perhaps different threads, right, or in different situations and regions of the world and all that. But so we have what we consider the key skills, diplomacy skills, in that chapter. But the way I've come to think about diplomacy as a profession, because diplomacy is both an activity and a profession, right? So in terms of the activity, what do diplomats do? Well, first of all, they manage relations with other countries, right? Just to put it simply, so the so-called general public can appreciate it. So that's what they do. In bilateral embassies or missions, they manage a relationship with that country on a daily basis. In multilateral missions, they manage a relationship with an organization like the UN or the EU, the NATO, and all that.
And with the member country.
And that's right. And then the other thing they do is carry out the foreign policy of their government. Right? These things are done in parallel. Okay, so what is in the big picture, what is the most important part of diplomacy? So I mentioned influence before, right? How to influence the decisions and actions of other countries, right? That in a way that perhaps correspond to your interests, right? The interests of the country you represent as a diplomat. And to bring back empathy, right? If you understand how they think, the other side, right? How they think, how they make decisions, where they're coming from, what their bottom line is for whatever you're talking about or negotiating, then you can do a little play and think like you believe they think, right? And come up with, okay, so what is the bottom line for them? What are their interests, right? Okay, and then you look at your own interests. This is where they diverge, this is where they converge, right? If they diverge, is there something we can do to make that divergence less obvious, right? So in that case, what do you need to do? You need to change their perception of their own circumstances. And sometimes you need actually to change the circumstances themselves. Now, I consider this to be the most difficult part of diplomacy, right? Because you're going to change the circumstances that other governments use to make decisions. Think of Putin right now in Ukraine, right? We'd love to know how he thinks and how he strategizes and to be ahead of him, right? And I'm just giving this as an example from the news, but you can apply this to any country. And so this is the strategy that Ambassador Pickering was talking about that we don't seem to be very good at. It'll be very, very effective if we were better at it. Mm-hmm. And it's we don't have to necessarily consider a war in this. We can apply this to Turkey and its prime minister. We can apply this to South Africa. I mean, it's any part of the world. And I don't think this happens enough, right? To strategize and think, okay, where are they? And where do we need them to be, right? This isn't necessarily something that will lead to conflict. Diplomacy, at the end of the day, is about compromise and ideally win-win scenarios, right? You don't have to have a situation where it's a zero sum, as we call it, right? And that's also a skill. But and then the last point, what you just said about applying this to any other field or profession or walk of life, absolutely. Most of this can be applied, all these skills. The difference is this: when you're a diplomat, you live and work in that other country on behalf of your government, and your job is to get things done that you've been instructed to do by your government in a foreign country and foreign society. So part of the job is navigating that society, knowing the right people, hopefully speaking the language, understanding their history and culture, right? Not just parachute in and think that they do what's called mirror imaging. In other words, that they think like we think, right? All of this is very difficult. And so I don't think any of us really, or most of us, are born with these skills. And some of us are better at them than others. But at the end of the day, you have to learn the skills. And it'll be nice to start learning them before you even get sent out. But absolutely, most of that you will learn on the job. There is no question of that.
Well, that is the purpose indeed of this book. And
Yes.
I want to encourage everyone out there. I want to thank, of course, the ambassadors who contributed to this book. And thank you to both gentlemen on stage for making this book possible. And I want to encourage everyone who wants to learn more. There are
Audience questions.
Yes. Well, I do want to, do we have time for audience
20
questions?
minutes.
Okay, good. All right, great. I would like to take a couple audience questions, and I also want to encourage the ambassadors who contributed to the book to give any comments that you would like to. So this is the first hand I saw. Yes, please.
Hi.
And please introduce yourself.
Can you wait for the mic? I'm sorry, there is a mic coming.
Oh, I can wait.
By the way, the ambassadors who contributed to the book, feel free to disagree with me. I don't mind. We don't all have to think the same way.
Thank you so much for coming out. Really appreciate hearing such amazing work that you've been doing. I am Denise Geronimo, and I am currently a Wrangell Fellow, and I'm joined here by other lovely Wrangell Fellows who will be future Foreign Service officers. And we've been talking a lot about future trainings, expanding trainings, and potentially more assessments, but I'm curious, what do State Department fellowships, like the Wrangell Fellowship, like the Pickering Fellowship, play in transforming and expanding training for future Foreign Service officers?
Great question.
Well, there's a Pickering Fellowship after it, so here is
Yes.
here is the Pickering of the Pickering Fellowship. So I think he was the best person to answer that.
Yeah. The fellowship is, with both Pickering and Wrangell's and Payne's, one of the single most important source for recruiting diversity. And it plays a very significant role. But it also, because it is based on an ROTC type principle, funds education in academia as part of the fellowship itself. And the fellows have to then pass the entrance examination and come into the Foreign Service. Some serve in aid, some serve in state, and so on. And I think it's an extremely important program. I was honored and very pleased that many months after I left the State Department, they finally revealed to me that they were going to name the existing fellowship program for me. And I said, well, I have only one concern. I have very strongly believed in my life you should never name anything for anybody who's still alive, for all of the obvious pitfalls. So far, I've avoided that without too much contortion. But it is something that I think is very significant. And over the years, I have fought with people on the Hill to increase the number of people being brought in each year in the programs. And I congratulate all of you who are part of those fellowship programs. It's a real achievement. And I think you will, in the course of your opening years, both on the academic side, because they help fund with the coordination of the schools involved, a year or two of graduate level training. It began originally with some funding of undergraduate level training. That's sort of dropped out, and I think we need to take a look and see whether that shouldn't be resuscitated, because not all people are financially able, but people who are good, capable students with a real interest in the Foreign Service could benefit greatly from having this extra academic training. It's been very interesting because in the course of my career, I've run across only one officer who did not have a university degree and was served in the Foreign Service, and I hired him. Because I thought he showed real capacity. He went to the California Institute of Technology and did a number of different subjects, but never concentrated in one long enough to get a degree. So he was not basically a hopeless case in any means. But it is very interesting because there is not a finite requirement for a college degree. But it is significant that we are moving into a position where, particularly in subjects with large technical content, in which we have to deal. You need to know a good bit more about what are basically things that can be learned in academic subjects as a basis for a career that will take on those subjects and put you in a position to be a useful policy suggester and formulator. I think there's only one other thing I would say. I thought that my primary job as ambassador, in addition to all the things that Nick and others have so usefully cataloged, beautifully cataloged, was that I had a responsibility to advise the Secretary of State and his key officers on when foreign policy wasn't working and what we should do about it. And that was a burden that I happily took on. I thought it was good, and I said to myself, I cannot write a cable to Washington that bears a significant stamp of concern without saying what I think we should do about it. Not that they were always followed. You don't get 100% in any government job. But it was something that I thought was important to be able to do, and that you were as well placed as anybody else. And I had very, very good staffs, which I worked with, to take a look at what I was writing as well, so that I had, in effect, a number of eyes and ears looking at the subject.
Thank you. I saw this lady in the front row. Yes, in the purple.
Right here. It'll be on your left. It's coming on the left, yeah.
I am Dr. Lopez from CIFAI. I have a question. One topic that was not discussed here is that you can buy a diplomatic post, and that happens all over the world. And also that you are friends of whoever is going to be the president, the minister, you get a post. And one very notorious example here in the United States, from many more, is Mr. Gordon Sondland. He gave $1 million to the Trump administration, and he ended up from being a diplomat. How come a hotelier was the ambassador of the European Union? That's my question. This is a very important topic, and that actually confirms what you say, that 90% of the people have no idea how to be a diplomat. And why? Because most of those posts are selected. They are not. People who are really career diplomats are very rare when they're really diplomats. That's all my comment.
Well, it's a good question, and we shouldn't spend much time on it because you can talk weeks about it. But diplomacy, it's interesting and in a way puzzling to me, because on one hand, few people care about diplomacy, but on the other hand, they think of it as prestigious enough to want to actually get all these posts, and they probably think that. Well, actually, I know for a fact that many of those political ambassadors think that the job is much easier than it actually is. Right? They don't know what it entails, and even after going through the 2 or now 3 week course orientation at FSI, they still don't fully understand what they're in for. Anyway, so I think it is an embarrassing practice to have a third of one country's ambassadors be appointed because of political connections or because of money. All right, and now I would not have a problem with it if their qualifications were also considered. I don't think a businessman is not shouldn't be qualified just by default. No, it's fine, whoever. But if they have the experience and the background and qualifications, that's okay. We've had actually some fantastic political ambassadors. Now, unfortunately, I could probably count them on my two hands, on the fingers of my two hands, in the last half century. But we have. I can name them, and I have named them in articles I've written, but I won't do it now, not to shame anyone. But I think the practice in itself is embarrassing for the country, to the world, because people in almost every country care very much who the US ambassador is. As the US ambassador, as much influence of one might argue the United States has lost in the last 20 or 30 years, I think in most countries still the US ambassador is a public figure. He or she is all the time in the media. People even know their names. they have, if not influence, at least they have a lot of attention on them, and so it makes a difference. And that's where I'll stop, and maybe Ambassador Pickering has a...
Yeah, the sale of public offices is called for the aficionado's simony. And simony is not compatible, in my view, with democracy or with meritocracy. And all of us in the career service have, over a period of time, both said that we have deep respect for the people who've been very successful.
Yes.
Not necessarily widely so, but there are, and we can't deny that. And the notion that out of the American Revolution grew the idea that any good man can serve the country beautifully has perhaps fallen on harder times. I also think that as a device for raising campaign contributions, much as I believe that election is a critical factor coming up this year, particularly in the future of our country, I don't believe that the use of selling offices, which is essentially what it is, even if it's a little more indirect than that, is a wise way of proceeding. And we don't, in effect, impart in the 3 weeks orientation program, I've been through it a number of times, a great deal of what I would call the kind of approach that you struggled and beautifully succeeded in putting in the book to orient and educate people. But there are some very good people who have stepped forward and have done a very good job, and we can't deny that. On the other hand, batting 125 is batting 125.
And thanks for the compliment. And you made a good point that I'll just take 10 seconds to follow up on it with the book. So what's in the book is the material that I and my colleagues believe that everybody should know before they start practicing diplomacy. You don't have to learn it from this book. If you have other ways to learn it, fine, right? But we've just tried to do people a favor and put it all in the same place. So that's really what the book is about. The skills, the competencies, the duties and responsibilities, which in fact is what Tradecraft means to begin with.
Do we have time for one last question? Okay, yes, sir, Ambassador Haft.
It's a short question.
The microphone is behind you.
Yes.
Yeah, John Teft, thanks for the great discussion. A question for Ambassador Pickering. Could you say a few words, Tom, about mentorship, specifically for younger officers once they get to post, no matter how much training they may have had, how good that training was or not, here in Washington at the Foreign Service Institute or elsewhere, what needs to be done and how, and I know from personal experience you're really good at this, how did you go about mentoring, training on the job, as it were, to make sure that these officers coming up under your command, as it were, did well and prepared for the future?
Thanks, John. John was my deputy. I chose him from a number of officers to come to Moscow and work with me there. And John himself did a formidable job under very difficult circumstances later on as ambassador in Moscow. And John, many congratulations and thanks for the way you did that job. In many ways, I plead that your kind congratulatory statements has to be reduced to the reality that you know and I know when you're ambassador to Moscow, there are only a certain number of things you can do in the day. And I relied very heavily on my deputies, like you, John, and Dick Miles and others, to take on a more focused effort to mentor junior officers. And at the same time, I thought that there were occasions in which we could do mentoring. I made it a practice to try to have embassy meetings with everybody present. And from time to time, John, I think we had our Russian staff present, which was somewhat shocking to some. But it was a teaching moment as well as obviously a communications moment. and that played something of a role in what we were doing. I would have put in the A100 course a module based on some careful research and practice, how you can get the most out of on-the-job learning or on-the-job training. So that in effect, while we did not produce the academic syllabus for that particular issue, we should produce the syllabus as to how to know, see, recognize, make use of, and use question and answer and contacts, and your reading and other things to digest what was there being given to you by successful diplomats recognizing their ongoing work. And that didn't mean that every successful diplomat should create a horn-blowing cable about how successful they are and this is what worked. But this does mean that you can see good work and recognize it, like other statements about other practices we won't go into at the moment. But it's part of how and in what way we do it. So I always thought that if on-the-job training was important, and I thought it was, a little help from the academic and educational side about how to make greater use of and more benefit of that particular piece of the syllabus, which was free. We didn't pay anybody to do on-the-job training extra. But we expected, in fact, that they would learn. And if we didn't help them understand what were the best techniques developed over the years by people in both learning and passing on learning, then it was an error that we could fix, and that should take place in the process. But John, thanks for the question, and I have, as I look back on my career, a strong feeling that I should have done a great deal more in this particular area.
5 minutes for one more. Is it the ambassador from Bulgaria?
Yes, yes.
Ambassador. Right down here. Yeah.
Ambassador.
Yeah, it's coming.
Thank you, thank you. Good afternoon already, everybody. I thought that a voice from Nick's mother country is befitting today. So I didn't mean to be the last one, it just happened. So thank you really for making the exception of adding one more question. I have a comment and...
And please identify yourself for everyone.
Oh, of course, I'm so sorry. My name is Elena Poptodorova. I've been a long-time ambassador of Bulgaria to this country, a total of 13 years, split practically equally into two parts. And that was a huge opportunity, of course, professionally and personally, even before coming over here, during those 13 years. And to this very day, I've been privileged to keep up a very special relationship with brilliant U.S. ambassadors. And Ambassador Pickering, you were, of course, one of those U.S. diplomats with whom I've had the honor of interacting. I want to make a brief comment on something which seems to be very sensitive across the world, and this is political appointments. Career diplomats like myself always feel a bit nervous when it comes to political appointees. But I would like to draw your attention to a big difference between America and, okay, I'll talk about Bulgaria only. In this country, you know that this is inevitable. You have to obviously meet more expediencies by making political appointments as ambassadors, but you also know that that can be balanced out, it can be remedied by a very strong professional team underneath. And this is something which normally is not done, and I should probably apologize for mentioning a name, but it is with affection and recognition and appreciation that I will be mentioning the name of a lady, Julie Finley, whom Ambassador Pickering may have met, or her husband, who was an elected representative. This lady was absolutely dedicated to the expansion of NATO, and since we are celebrating this year the 75th, and I'll be back in July for the big meeting here, I would probably be kind of in good context here. So because of her total, not just dedication, but contribution to the expansion with the last seven, not last, we had more, but the big bang of 7 countries, she was then sent to Vienna, because Vienna is really a very nice city. But Ambassador Pickering, she had to lead your delegation to the Organization of Security and Cooperation, the OSCE. And the professional diplomats in this room know very well what a complex set of issues that is. And you definitely need a professional there. So I don't think she ended up very happy after a few months on the job, but she did have this very solid team of professionals underneath. In the case of my country, unfortunately, we have to live with a political appointee without necessarily being able to support the political appointee with a really forceful, strong team, or also having an ambassador, a political ambassador, who would recognize the importance of expertise. So you're still, I think, ahead of many others in terms of how you handle political appointments. And that was just a professional temptation. I had to comment. But I would like to tell you that I also had this special, very special pleasure in life of watching somebody grow from young years in professional career as Nick, whom I first met when he was still a journalist, and we actually worked together on a number of secretaries' visits also to my country. And then I watched him grow up in the profession to only transcend into what is definitely a career which is so close to my heart. And definitely this is such a pride, such a pleasure to see you sitting over there, Nick, and kind of being able to reach the top of a career which can only be positively and amicably and fondly envied. So thank you, and every good luck onwards.
Well, thank you, very kind. I'm not sure I'm at the top, but thank you. Yeah, thanks, that's very kind.
Well, I want to thank Ambassador Taylor and the U.S. Institute of Peace for hosting this very important and fun discussion. And please join me in thanking Nicholas Kralev and Ambassador Tom Pickering for their wonderful discussion.